let's just get started with the bottom tier stuff. Let's just get in with the things that I think are the worst or just not really that good. And the very first thing I'm going to put in this list is actually something that I've been thinking about for a bit. In the bottom tier of subs, I'm going to put Toxic Mist. And the reason why is Toxic Mist costs way too much for how little value it gets. Toxic Mist is supposed to be like a toned back version of the Disruptor, but the Toxic Mist is just infinitely weaker and is like the highest cost special or sub in the entire game. It realistically does nothing. It slightly deters people. Sure, if somebody wants to like swim in the middle of a Toxic Mist, but weapons that have Toxic Mist are mostly a detriment. They don't really benefit from it. The only thing I would argue that may benefit from it is maybe the Kensa Mini, because you could play the Kensa Mini similar to how the Zinc Mini in Splatoon 1 worked, but even then, the Zinc Mini in Splatoon 1 was really good because the Disruptor paralyzed people for a prolonged period of time even after they left the AoE field. Toxic Mist only works as people are in that field. I feel like Toxic Mist could be so much more useful if they just reduced the cost of it, which they have done already once before, but I still think it costs way too much for how little value the actual sub itself gets. And then Disruptor from Splatoon 1, that would probably be put pretty high up. And that's because the Disruptor, as I mentioned, basically paralyzed opponents. Think of people that may not have played Splatoon 1, think of the Toxic Mist, except once somebody has been in the Toxic Mist, they have those effects for like, 8 seconds? And they would glow to anybody. They would have an effect that would outline them to anybody that went past them. And it had all the effects. It was seen as not really that useful at the start. It wasn't until like the Zinc Mini started getting really popular that people started to use it more often because the Zinc was really good with it. Basically just disabling entire enemy's kit while you could just run them down was really good. The Disruptor was really good for the weapons that had it, and was certainly a much better version of the Toxic Mist. I also apologize if you hear any of my cat playing in the background. He loves to start playing once I start recording or streaming or anything like that. Anyway, next up, the Ink Mine. So this is something that's a bit tricky because this is where I would place Ink Mines slightly different depending on the game. Not very different from where each other sit. In Splatoon 1, I would put Ink Mine in the sea. Because Ink Mine, while it could kill in Splatoon 1, it was almost never going to. It was pretty useless in Splatoon 1. The only practical use it had would be placing in a splat zone, and that was it. You would just place it in the zone and walk away. In Splatoon 2, I would only slightly bump it up to B. And that's only because you can place 2 of them, and they mark people. Having the knowledge that someone has triggered your Ink Mine is pretty important, and seeing where they're going is pretty good, but Ink Mine itself still isn't really that useful. Especially because now it can't kill anymore, it just does, 30 to 40 damage. So it could be good starting damage or good follow-up damage if someone's trying to chase you, but realistically Ink Mine is not great in either game. Auto Bomb, this is something I've always had a differing opinion on Auto Bomb than the rest of the community, all the way from the start of the game, where nobody liked the Auto Bomb because it couldn't kill. It wasn't like a Suction Bomb or a Splat Bomb. There was no immediate damage. Auto Bomb existed as just like as a way to just point where people are going or point where people were at, and nobody really liked that. I kind of liked it for the idea of the utility it provides. And this was, if my old Twitter existed still, we could have gone back and looked through some of my old tweets where I was talking about the auto bomb when it was first shown off. And I was like, if the auto bomb can detect people who are hiding in their ink, that's amazing. Because the early footage of it never showed that. But then I think at like the E3 event where people got to play it, I don't remember who it was, but somebody informed me that the auto bomb did detect people who were hiding in ink. That's a big deal for some weapons. And notably in, well, my playtime, the Octobrush. Having something that is so dependent on being careful of where it moves, especially with the way I used to play it, you would want to really know that an area is safe before you move forward, and an auto bomb being able to tell you if anybody nearby you is even so much as sharking, that's a pretty big deal. All of my early Octobrush builds revolved around auto bomb spam, even before you could do double auto bomb. Again, I wish I had some of my old screenshots from Twitter. My oldest Octobrush build was mostly ink recovery because the cost of auto bomb was significantly higher, but its recovery time was lower. So it was better to run ink recovery for auto bomb spam than it was to run Subsaver. But in its overall utility, auto bomb isn't great. If it's on a weapon that is short range, it can have value, but for most weapons that have auto bomb that aren't short range, then the auto bomb doesn't really serve that great of a purpose. And so for that purpose and that reason, I'm going to put it just in B, because it has its uses, but overall, if it's not sitting in a specific situation, then its overall usefulness is lowered. If you're not playing something like the Octobrush that needs that assurance that nobody's in its way or that no one's hiding waiting for it, then the auto bomb just really acts as a small distraction. It doesn't give you immediate paint, and you're probably not going to be throwing it as much as you would a Splat Bomb or Suction Bomb. Its value is just lower. Next up is the Curling Bomb, which Curling Bomb is super useful. I'm going to just put it in A, because the utility of a Curling Bomb is pretty high, even though itself is not a very threatening sub-weapon. It's just the utility of it that makes it so good. It is quick paint, it is a quick path, it is a quick distraction, and if you want to be that person that can cook the auto bomb, then it could be a slightly dangerous bomb. It's Seeker, but really good. And speaking of Seeker, that's what's next. The biggest problem I had with Seeker was Seeker's design is in its name. It's supposed to seek out things and chase them. If you threw a Seeker with the intent of following behind it, if that Seeker just so happened to detect somebody while you were pressing R, then the Seeker's no longer going in a straight line, and it's just going to make a beeline for whoever it saw. This made it very difficult for some weapons that could make good use of the Seeker, like weapons that try to be sneaky, that would use a Seeker to trail it, like how people would do with curling bombs now. Imagine doing that with a sub that may just decide, oh, I want to try and take a 90-degree turn right here. Even though it couldn't take a 90-degree turn, it would try to turn into that and just go after somebody else instead. And then suddenly your path forward is no longer there. It was still decent in terms of helping your team get to the middle of the point or getting to the middle of the map. If there was nobody there, it was good, but if you were in the middle of a fight or you were trying to get to the middle of a fight, there was a chance that the Seeker wouldn't do what you wanted to do. So I'm going to put it in B just because its utility, much like the auto bomb, is very limited to certain situations. It can be good for getting back and getting forward, but if there is even so much as a single person in your way, then it really devalues the sub itself, and its entire other purpose, the one that Nintendo designed it for, gets in the way of what you're trying to do with it. Next up, we have the Burst Bomb. Burst Bomb, we all know, Burst Bomb is considered one of the highest tier subs in the entire game. Across both games, Burst Bomb has unanimously been the solution to all weapons problems. And the reason being is that Burst Bomb is possibly the highest utility sub in the entire game, both games. There's so much a Burst Bomb can do that no other sub comes close to even comparing in its usefulness. Burst Bomb can be for initiation, starting a fight. It can be for ending a fight. It can be for mobility. It can be for painting. It can be for scaling walls. There's so much a Burst Bomb can do that it's just definitively the best sub. And across years of Splatoon, anytime someone has talked about a weapon falling short because of its sub and special, everyone pretty much comes to the conclusion that the best way to fix any problem with a kit is to just give it Burst Bomb. And for a lot of weapons, it would. A lot of weapons, if you think, oh, its sub is awful, if you gave it a Burst Bomb, then suddenly the weapon would probably have a much better chance at doing things because of how much overall utility the Burst Bomb itself has. It's just really, really good. And that's why I think Nintendo is probably not going to focus on this. We already had a huge diminishing amount of sub or weapons in Splatoon 2 that had the Burst Bomb. If Burst Bomb returned in Splatoon 3, I would be surprised if Nintendo gave it to more weapons. I don't remember the exact count of how many weapons in Splatoon 2 have Burst Bomb, but I know it's not large. I think it's in the single digits, where in Splatoon 1 I think it was in double digits that had Burst Bomb. I'd be surprised if more weapons had Burst Bomb, just because it provides so much. So many weapons would benefit from it, and I think if they ever introduced a system where you could make your own kits, I think Burst Bomb would probably have the highest pick rate of any sub in the entire game, just because it combos so well off every single weapon. Suction Bomb is another really good one. I'm going to put that in S, because Suction Bomb's usefulness is also really high. The amount of, how creative you can get with a Suction Bomb is higher than a lot of bombs in the game, and in both games, just because it can stick to surfaces. There are so many ways you can stick like a Burst Bomb underneath a grate or a platform and get kills on people that had no idea that there was a Suction Bomb there. There's so much creativity in the usefulness of a Suction Bomb, and then it also has the highest damage of any sub as well. It's just an overall really good sub, and for a good chunk of Splatoon 1, it was considered the best lethal bomb, and it probably still is considered the best lethal bomb. And then closely followed up by the Splat Bomb, because Splat Bomb is also very useful in all the utilities that it has. It's not as creative as the Suction Bomb, but the Splat Bomb acting as pretty much the default grenade, and a pretty standard grenade at that, just makes it a really good choice for just about anything. It does really good painting, it has really good damage. It's just an overall really good lethal bomb that I think it sits fair at A, being about middle of the road. Torpedo, this is a bit of an interesting one. This and Fizzy Bomb for me, I haven't had too much experience with because I don't really play weapons that use them. But I would say Torpedo probably sits at A, just because Torpedo acts as a good distraction. In the same way that Auto Bomb acts as a distraction, however, unlike Auto Bomb, or Torpedo poses a more immediate threat. If it's not addressed pretty quickly, then a Torpedo can quickly become a serious threat. If you don't break it, then it's going to explode all over you. And it's relatively cheap enough to where weapons can use it as a mid-fight distraction. If you're in the middle of fighting something and it throws a torpedo, or someone else throws a torpedo at you, you're not going to let the torpedo go because it's probably going to do more damage to you than whatever it is you're fighting. you want to immediately draw your attention to the torpedo itself. And so I think it's in the same camp as Auto Bomb being a distraction more than a lethal bomb, but it does a better job because it poses a quicker threat than Auto Bomb does. Auto Bomb makes a loud noise, I guess Torpedo does too, and Torpedo is slightly more visible, but it is a more immediate threat than Auto Bomb is. So that's why I would classify it a bit higher. Fizzy Bomb, this is, again, I don't really have too much experience using weapons that have Fizzy Bomb. Fizzy Bomb is an interesting one in that they actually tried to incorporate an interesting gimmick in that how you charge the bomb itself. I would still probably put Fizzy Bomb probably in B, maybe like if I got into super detail, it probably would be like a B+. Just because Fizzy Bomb itself is really good for getting paint coverage and like disrupting people, but Fizzy Bomb isn't anywhere near as good of a lethal bomb as the Splat Bomb is, or provides enough utility as like the curling bomb would. The Fizzy Bomb I would consider more of just like disruption and just trying to cause like chaos, or just throwing something to cause paint, or, well, I guess to repeat myself, disruption. It's not nearly in the same tier as the curling bomb, Splat Bomb, or Torpedo in my opinion, but it does have its really good uses. It's just not really high in that camp. Then Squid Beacon. Beacons have had a pretty rough life when it comes to how they're valued. In Splatoon 1, most people did not care about beacons because everybody wanted to have that time back towards mid to paint for their specials. That, and also very few beacon weapons early on were even considered like usable. The crack-on splat roller in Splatoon 1 was, like, for the longest time, the only real viable beacon weapon. Other weapons, people needed to have a burst bomb or a splash wall. So to have a beacon wasn't really that optimal. It was the crack-on and the custom E-leader that were like the definitive beacon weapons. Everything else was not worth using it. It wasn't until map design started getting larger and larger, and then Splatoon 2 having larger map design and a more emphasized focus on being always available in the fights, that Beacon started to go up in usability. I would put Beacon at A for its overall usefulness. There's so much that a Beacon can do for your team, especially now where you can increase or decrease rather, the time it takes to jump to a beacon with sub power up. There is no situation where a beacon isn't useful to a team. It's also probably more useful now than Splatoon 1 ever was, because in Splatoon 1 you didn't need a beacon when you could just have stealth jump. It didn't matter. As long as one teammate was alive, you could just stealth jump and probably be fine. Now that stealth jump can be camped, well, it's a lot more dangerous to stealth jump. So providing safe jumps and guaranteed safe jumps in the form of beacons is a lot more useful. That, and they also made beacons a lot more interesting in the fact that they can actually tell you if somebody's nearby your beacon. That way you'll know if it's safe to jump to one or not. Then we have Sprinkler. Sprinkler is probably going to be in B. And the reason being is Sprinkler is very one note in what it does. It only paints. You could argue that it could act as a distraction because most enemies probably don't want you to just get free ink, but the overall usefulness of a Sprinkler is very one note, and it's very obvious that all it's going to be used for is to paint. It can't be used as a lethal bomb, it can't be used really as disruption or anything of that sort. It's just really one note. And the only reason why it's not in C, being one note like the Toxic Mist is because a Sprinkler actually has value. Splash Wall we're going to put in S, because Splash Wall, like the Disruptor and Suction Bomb, has a ton of usefulness to it. It has a ton of utility and aids almost every single weapon that has it. Much like with Disruptor and Suction Bomb, any weapon that has the splash wall almost always will benefit from having the splash wall. Barring like the Tenebrella having a splash wall for some reason, that one doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But in almost every situation, a weapon that has a splash wall is almost always going to be good because of said splash wall. And splash wall itself has had a pretty storied history of being really good. For those that didn't know, back in Splatoon 1, splash wall actually used to allow you to stand in the center of it, basically what they called showering, where you would stand underneath the rain that the splash wall would create, and it used to have no repercussions to it. Now if somebody were to do that, if you threw a bomb into it, they would take damage from the bomb. Early Splatoon 1, they didn't have that, so you could stand inside your splash wall and basically be invulnerable. That you couple with old school 52 gal and 96 gal deco, which were like super high level at the time that they came out. Splash wall was super dominant, that high level teams often ran 2 to 3 splash wall weapons. It was really an interesting time. It was also a really scary time for me to be a brush player, going into teams that would run on 52 and 96 deco and like an E leader. Those are like the kind of scary comps you would fear going into at the time. Now if somebody uses a splash wall, there are better answers for it, but it still stands that any weapon that has a splash wall benefits from having the splash wall itself. So that's why I'd put it in S. Just the overall usefulness of it is higher, even though it doesn't really pose that much of a threat anymore. And then finally, we have point sensor. Point sensor, it's an interesting situation of that it's always been seen as useless. Point sensor has almost always been seen as something that isn't really useful in the slightest because you could just make calls. However, I feel that point sensor has had a purpose in that you could assist people who you can't communicate to. It sits in a camp where it could be useful to randos that can't see what you're doing and people that may not be might not have as much skill in like aiming. Point sensor assists in like pointing out things, making things obvious. So it's always been seen as worthless in competitive play because you could always just make callouts instead, and as long as the team was doing active callouts, then the usefulness of the point sensor was mute. There was no reason for it. They tried to make it slightly better in Splatoon 2 by having it act as a standing AoE, where if somebody were to pass through it, then it would mark them as well. Where in Splatoon 1, it was just whoever got hit by the initial AoE would be marked. I'm going to put it in B because, like I mentioned with the other ones, it provides a purpose, but it is a situational purpose. It's not good in the vast majority of situations it could be used in, but it is also not entirely useless. It may seem like I'm being pretty rough to something like the Toxic Mist, claiming that it's got no usefulness in comparison to something like a point sensor, but the reality is that Toxic Mist provides so little value for how much you have to put into it. It costs way too much for how useless it is, and all it would really take to fix Toxic Mist and make it go up into B would just be to reduce its cost. I've had discussions with people for the last couple of years about a good way to make Toxic Mist more useful was if Toxic Mist had a lingering effect, where if you got hit by Toxic Mist, you were in the middle of a cloud, and then you escaped, you would have a bit of a lingering effect from it, depending on how long you were in the Toxic Mist. So say, if I was in the Toxic Mist for a second, and then I get out of the Toxic Mist, well, for 1 second, I still have the lingering effects of being inside it. But if I got out of it almost instantly, then I have almost no side effects from it. If I was in the Toxic Mist for the whole time, the whole duration of it, then I would have essentially the double duration of its effects. I feel like that wouldn't be too absurd, because most times people that get hit by Toxic Mist will almost always immediately leave, which would result in them having little to no drawback to it. There would be almost no repercussion for being in there for so long. But if you could manage to trap somebody in a Toxic Mist for a prolonged period of time, where they're essentially doubling it by leaving, then I think that provides some usefulness to it. But as it stands, I feel that Toxic Mist is probably like the weakest sub in the entirety of both games, just because it doesn't really provide any sort of usefulness for how much you have to invest to use it. I didn't really mention it with the other ones, but Splash Wall being S, I would keep it here for both games. Same with Beacon, it'd be here for both games. And Sprinkler and Point Sensor would be there for both games. Just because those ones serve the exact same purpose across games, so I feel like there wasn't enough changes to warrant them going up or down in a tier. They just are fine where they sit.